Somewhere under Oakland right now, at this exact second while you're watching this, the ground is moving. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone can feel, but it's moving. Millimeter by millimeter, year after year, the Earth beneath one of the most densely populated regions in North America is storing up energy it has been storing for 158 years. And on the morning of August 13th, 2026, a small piece of that energy let go. A magnitude 3. 8 earthquake ripped through the East Bay near San Leandro at 8:30 in the morning, right as people were pouring coffee, dropping kids at school, merging onto the freeway. Within minutes, aftershocks followed. Thousands of residents from Santa Rosa to Santa Cruz to Sacramento felt the ground sway beneath them. Nobody died, no buildings fell. And normally, that would be the end of the story. A footnote. A slightly unsettling Tuesday, except this time it isn't the end of the story. Because just months before that swarm hit, in April of 2026, a group of scientists at 2 of the most advanced research laboratories on Earth quietly published a study that most people never heard about. And what that study found should terrify anyone living in the San Francisco Bay Area. It says the next major earthquake on this fault could shake the ground 50% harder than what every building, every bridge, every hospital in the region was designed to survive. Not 10% harder. Not 20, 50. Stay with me for the next half hour because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what changed, why scientists are more worried than they have been in decades, and what it actually means for the roughly 40 million people who call this state home. This is not fear for the sake of fear. This is the updated science, laid out in plain language so you can decide for yourself what to do with it. Let's start with the fault that just moved, because it is not just any fault. It's called the Hayward Fault. And if you ask 10 seismologists which fault worries them most in the entire United States, most of them would not say the San Andreas. They would say this one. The Hayward Fault runs for roughly 74 miles in a nearly straight line through the heart of the East Bay. It passes directly beneath Oakland. It splits UC Berkeley's football stadium almost in half. It runs beneath Berkeley, Hayward, Fremont, San Leandro, El Chorrito, Richmond, and Milpitas. BART tunnels cross underneath it. Major hospitals sit on top of it. Millions of people sleep every night directly above a fault line capable of producing an earthquake that could reshape the region in under a minute. Here's the part that should give you pause. The last time this fault ruptured in a major event was October 21st, 1868. That quake killed around 30 people in a Bay Area that held a fraction of today's population. And at the time, it was considered the Great San Francisco Earthquake, a title later overshadowed by 1906. That was 158 years ago. Scientists who study the buried layers of Earth along the fault, a field called paleoseismology, have found evidence of roughly a dozen major ruptures on the southern Hayward Fault going back nearly 2,000 years. On average, those ruptures happen every 140 to 160 years. Do the math. We are sitting right inside that window right now, creeping toward the far edge of it. That is not speculation. That is not fear-mongering. That is the U.S. Geological Survey's own modeling. Based on this recurrence pattern combined with continuous GPS measurements of the plates grinding past each other, the USGS estimates roughly a 1 in 3 chance, about 33%, of a magnitude 6, 7 or larger earthquake on the Hayward Fault system before the year 2043. When you widen the lens to the entire San Francisco Bay Area, accounting for every major fault including the Hayward, the Calaveras, and the San Andreas itself, that number climbs to somewhere between 72 and 95%, depending on which model you use. Let that sink in. Not a coin flip on a single fault. A near certainty that somewhere in this region, sometime in the coming decades, the ground is going to move violently. Now, here is where the story most people have not heard comes in, the part that makes this week's small earthquake actually matter. Back in April of 2026, researchers at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published a study in a journal called Seismological Research Letters. What they did was remarkable. They used exascale computing, the most powerful class of supercomputer that currently exists on the planet, to run dozens of highly detailed simulations of a major Hayward Fault rupture. These weren't rough estimates. They modeled how seismic waves would actually travel through the specific rock and soil layers beneath the East Bay, accounting for the geology in a level of detail that older models simply could not achieve. What they found stunned people in the field. The simulations showed that a major rupture on this fault could generate shaking up to 50% more intense than what current building codes and retrofit standards were designed around. Read that again. Every building in Oakland, every reinforced apartment complex in Berkeley, every retrofitted brick storefront in Hayward, engineered and inspected and signed off on the assumption of a certain level of shaking, and that assumption may now be off by half. The threat grew. The buildings did not. That gap between what we built for and what the Earth might actually deliver is the single most important thing to understand about California's earthquake risk in 2026. To understand what that gap actually means in human terms, you have to look at what scientists already knew before this revision, because even the old numbers were staggering. Years earlier, the USGS ran an extensive modeling project called the Hayward scenario, imagining a magnitude 7 earthquake centered in Oakland on this exact fault. Even using the older, now understated shaking estimates, the results were grim. Somewhere between 800 and 1,000 deaths, up to 18,000 serious injuries, more than 400,000 people displaced from their homes, over $82 billion in direct property damage and business disruption, a figure the Association of Bay Area Governments later revised upward to roughly $165 billion once you factor in the ripple effects across the wider economy. More than 5 million people directly affected in some way. And that was the conservative version. Before scientists confirmed the shaking could be 50% stronger than assumed, there is one detail buried in that scenario that keeps emergency planners awake at night more than almost anything else, and it is not collapsing buildings. It is water. A pipeline called the Hetchy Aqueduct supplies roughly 85% of San Francisco's drinking water, and it physically crosses directly over the Hayward Fault in Fremont. If the fault ruptures, engineers widely expect that pipeline to rupture with it. The Hayward study estimates that as many as 2.4 million Bay Area residents could lose water service, not for a day, not for a week, but potentially for weeks at a time, while crews work to locate and repair breaks across a shattered, inaccessible pipeline network. Without water, hospitals cannot run at full capacity during the exact moment they are needed most. Without water, firefighters cannot fight the fires that inevitably start when gas lines rupture and downed power lines spark. This is not a hypothetical concern. It is almost precisely what happened in 1906, when the San Francisco earthquake itself killed a relatively contained number of people. But the fires that followed, fires firefighters could not extinguish because the water mains had failed, burned for 3 straight days and killed far more people than the shaking ever did. And here is a detail that almost never makes it into mainstream coverage of California earthquake risk. Only about 13% of California homeowners carry earthquake insurance. 13%. That means roughly 9 out of every 10 households in the state have no financial protection whatsoever against what may be the single most statistically foreseeable disaster this state will ever face. When the big one hits, and it eventually will, the vast majority of people are going to be paying for the aftermath entirely out of their own pocket, on top of a mortgage that may now be attached to a pile of rubble instead of a house. Now let's zoom out, because the Hayward Fault, as dangerous as it is only one piece of a much larger system under strain across the entire state simultaneously. California sits directly on top of the boundary between 2 of the planet's major tectonic plates, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, grinding past each other in what geologists call a transform boundary. The visible scar of that boundary is the San Andreas Fault System, which runs for nearly the entire 800-mile length of the state, but the San Andreas is not one single crack. It is a sprawling web of connected and parallel faults, including the Hayward, the Calaveras, the Rogers Creek, the Elsinore, the Garlock, and dozens of smaller branches you have probably never heard of. Every single one of them is storing stress right now. Every single one of them has to release that stress eventually, whether that happens in a slow, harmless creep or in a sudden, violent rupture. The scale of exposure here is almost impossible to comprehend. The most recent statewide seismic hazard assessment, built on the USGS's Unified California Earthquake Rupture Forecast, shows that roughly 16 million Californians and about $3 trillion worth of buildings and infrastructure sit inside zones officially rated as extreme seismic hazard, meaning the expected ground shaking during a major quake could exceed half the force of gravity. $3 trillion of structures sitting in the highest risk category that exists. In Los Angeles County alone, 10 million residents live within about 50 kilometers of at least 3 separate faults, each capable of producing a magnitude 7 or larger earthquake on its own. The Bay Area's roughly 8 million residents carry a comparable level of exposure, driven largely by the Hayward Fault sitting almost directly beneath their homes. Further south, the picture gets even more unsettling. The southernmost stretch of the San Andreas Fault, near the Salton Sea northeast of San Diego, has not produced a major rupture since somewhere between 1690 and 1700, based on geological evidence buried in the sediment. That is more than 300 years of accumulated strain on a segment that typically cycles every 150 to 200 years. In plain terms, this section of the San Andreas has been building pressure for roughly double its normal cycle length. USGS geophysicist Morgan Page has been careful to note there is no fixed timetable for exactly when a fault ruptures, but the buildup of stress here is real, it is ongoing, and it is measurable with modern instruments. Just this past May, a new swarm of small earthquakes shook the Salton Sea region again, activity concentrated in what is known as the Berkeley seismic zone, sitting right in the tangled junction between the San Andreas and the Imperial Fault. USGS scientists tracked that swarm closely. Experts are quick to point out that any individual swarm has a low probability of triggering a full San Andreas rupture. But low is not zero. As USGS geophysicist Andy Michael has described it, this junction is a genuinely complicated tangle of structures that may connect the two fault zones, and every new swarm is another signal that the area remains active, loaded, and fundamentally unpredictable. There's another overdue stretch worth knowing about, one that almost never gets mentioned outside of academic papers. The segment of the San Andreas near Tejon Pass, the geographic link connecting southern and northern California, has not ruptured since the Great Fort Tejon earthquake of 1857, a staggering magnitude 7/9 event. Its estimated recurrence interval is roughly 100 years. It has now been about 169 years since it last moved, just as overdue as the southern Salton Sea segment, and just as loaded with stored energy. Now, before you start looking at the ground with suspicion every time you step outside, it is important to understand what overdue actually means, because this word gets misused constantly. Faults do not run on human calendars. They have no concept of the fact that 300 years have passed near the Salton Sea, or that it has been 158 years along the Hayward. Recurrence intervals are statistical averages, calculated from geological evidence spanning centuries. Any single gap between ruptures can run shorter or longer than that average. Being overdue does not mean a fault is guaranteed to rupture next Tuesday, or next year, or even in the next decade. It means the underlying conditions, the accumulated stress, the elapsed time, match what has historically preceded major ruptures in the geological record. It means the odds have shifted, not that a specific date is locked in. Still, when you step back and look at everything together, the picture is hard to ignore. Over 500 earthquakes of magnitude 2, 5 or greater were recorded across California in just the opening stretch of 2026 alone. In the most recent month tracked, over 50 quakes above magnitude 2, 5 struck across the state. Live seismic monitoring networks that researchers watch around the clock show constant, near-continuous activity across the entire fault system, all day, every day, whether or not anyone feels it. The ground beneath California genuinely never stops moving. It is simply a question of scale, and of which fault finally lets go with enough force to make headlines. Looking across the 30-year window running through the middle of this century, the statewide numbers become even harder to dismiss. Because California has so many active fault systems stacked on top of one another, the odds of a magnitude 6, 7 or larger earthquake striking somewhere in the state during that span are extremely high, essentially treated by scientists as a near certainty rather than a possibility. For the Los Angeles region specifically, the 30-year probability of a major rupture on a nearby fault sits around 60%. For the Bay Area, driven heavily by the Hayward Fault, that number climbs to somewhere around 72%. With some newer models pushing it even higher. Let's put that 72% into terms that actually mean something. If you are 30 years old and living in the Bay Area right now, there is roughly a 3 in 4 chance that a magnitude 6, 7 or larger earthquake strikes the region before you turn 60, before your kids graduate, before your mortgage is paid off, assuming the house is even still standing by then. This is not some distant, abstract statistic buried in a government report. This is closer to a coin flip that happens to land, not on a coin, but on entire neighborhoods full of people. Now, to be fair, California is not standing here completely unprepared. There's real protection in place, and it deserves to be acknowledged honestly. The Shake Alert Early Warning System is one of the most significant pieces of infrastructure the West Coast has built in the last decade. When a fault begins to rupture, sensors near the epicenter detect the initial, faster moving waves before the slower, more destructive shaking waves arrive. That gap, sometimes just a few seconds, sometimes tens of seconds depending on your distance from the epicenter, is enough time to matter enormously. Shake Alert pushes wireless emergency alerts directly to phones in the affected zone. It feeds into the MyShake app that anyone can download for free. It is wired directly into automated safety systems on BART trains, in hospital operating rooms, and across utility networks that can automatically shut down gas lines the instant a warning fires. In a major event, those few seconds can mean a surgeon stepping back from an operating table, a train automatically applying its brakes, a person stepping away from a window and getting under something sturdy before the worst of the shaking arrives. Those seconds genuinely, measurably save lives. But here is the uncomfortable truth underneath all of that good news. Shake Alert cannot stop an earthquake from happening. It cannot reinforce a crumbling brick building that predates modern codes. It cannot protect a water pipeline that runs directly across an active fault line. It cannot retroactively bring the roughly 1 million buildings across California that were built before modern seismic standards up to today's requirements. All it gives you is warning. What happens once that warning fires depends entirely on the preparation, or the lack of it, that came before that moment. And that is really the uncomfortable position California finds itself in as it heads deeper into 2026. The state has some of the strongest seismic building codes in the entire world for new construction. Its scientific research institutions are genuinely world-class. Its monitoring network is among the best on the planet, and yet roughly 1 million buildings statewide predate modern seismic standards entirely. Tens of thousands of unreinforced masonry buildings, old brick structures with no steel reinforcement, are still standing in historic downtown districts across the state, despite retrofit laws that in some cities have existed for years. Compliance remains far from complete. Retrofitting is expensive, it is slow, and for many property owners, it keeps getting pushed to next year and then the year after that. Soft story buildings deserve special mention here because most people walk past them every day without realizing what they're looking at. These are typically apartment buildings with a weak, open ground floor, often built as a parking garage or a row of storefronts with large open spaces and minimal supporting walls. During an earthquake, that weak ground floor tends to collapse first, sometimes pancaking the floors above it straight down. California has retrofit mandates for these buildings in many cities, but compliance is nowhere near universal, and renters in particular often have absolutely no idea what condition the building they sleep in every single night is actually in. Now zoom back in on the Calaveras Fault for a moment, because there is an additional layer of concern here that deserves attention. The Calaveras Fault runs roughly parallel to the Hayward Fault along its eastern edge, cutting through the Tri-Valley area east of the main urban corridor. Researchers at UC Berkeley have found evidence that the Hayward and Calaveras faults are physically linked at depth. If both segments were to rupture together in a single event, a scenario seismologists consider genuinely plausible rather than purely theoretical, the resulting earthquake could reach magnitude 7. 3 instead of the more commonly modeled 6. 7 to 7. 0 range, a magnitude 7. 3 releases roughly double the energy of a magnitude 7. 0, on a fault system running directly beneath millions of residents with buildings calibrated to shaking levels now known to be understated by as much as half, with critical water infrastructure crossing the fault line itself, and with firefighting capability tied directly to that same vulnerable water supply, a combined Hayward-Calaveras rupture would represent a defining generational disaster for the entire Bay Area. Let's talk about what actually happens in the days and weeks after a major earthquake like this, because that part gets almost completely ignored in most coverage, and it genuinely shouldn't be. If the shaking itself is not the disaster. The shaking is the trigger. The disaster is everything that comes after it. When the Hayward Fault eventually produces its next major rupture, the immediate structural damage will be severe and immediate. Unreinforced masonry buildings and soft-story apartment complexes scattered through Oakland, Berkeley, and Hayward will be among the first to fail. Roads will crack open in places, overpasses will require inspection and possible closure before anyone can drive across them again. Major crossings like the Bay Bridge will need to be cleared for structural safety, a process that can stretch from hours into multiple days depending on the extent of the damage. But it is the interdependency of modern infrastructure that keeps emergency planners up at night more than almost anything else. Power, water, gas, communications, and transportation in a modern city are not separate systems. They are wired together, dependent on each other in ways most people never think about until they fail simultaneously. You cannot fully restore electrical power without functioning transportation to physically move repair crews and heavy equipment to damaged substations. You cannot restore water service without electrical power running the pumping stations that push water through the system. You cannot restore transportation routes without inspecting every single bridge and overpass along them, work that itself requires personnel and machinery that the disaster has also disrupted or destroyed. Emergency planners have a name for this. They call it cascading failure, where the breakdown of one system blocks the repair of every other system connected to it, leaving an entire urban region limping along at a fraction of normal capacity for weeks, sometimes months. There is a real-world precedent for a piece of this. During the 1994 Northridge earthquake in Los Angeles, a magnitude 7 event, notably smaller than what is projected for a major Hayward rupture, water service was knocked out for hundreds of thousands of customers, and full restoration in some neighborhoods took weeks, not days. Now imagine that same failure pattern, but layered on top of a pipeline that runs directly across the fault that just ruptured, in a region with roughly 8 million residents instead of a smaller localized area. That is the scale of the water problem the Bay Area is potentially staring down. To California's genuine credit, real progress has been made toward resilience over the past several decades, and it would be dishonest not to mention it. The state has passed legislation mandating the expansion of earthquake early warning infrastructure. Numerous cities have rolled out mandatory retrofit ordinances targeting the most dangerous building types. Shake Alert now operates statewide rather than as a regional pilot program. Regional mutual aid agreements mean that when a major earthquake hits any part of California, resources from across the state and from neighboring states begin moving toward the affected region almost immediately, without waiting for a lengthy request process. None of that progress is trivial. It represents decades of hard-won advocacy, funding battles, and lessons learned the hard way from previous disasters. But progress is not the same thing as readiness, and this is really the core of what changed this year. The updated Lawrence Livermore shaking models, showing a major Hayward earthquake, could generate up to 50% more intense shaking than the standards buildings and retrofits were actually designed around. The region is meaningfully less prepared than its retrofit compliance statistics might otherwise suggest on paper. Structures engineered to withstand a certain specific threshold of ground motion are now expected to face significantly more force than they were ever built for. Some of those buildings will hold up fine. Some of them will not, and right now nobody can tell you with certainty which category any specific building falls into without a proper structural assessment. So where does that leave you, sitting here right now, watching this video? It leaves you with a genuine choice, because here's the thing about earthquake science that almost never gets said clearly enough. None of this information is meant to spark despair. Despair does not help anyone, and it never has. Preparation helps. That is the entire reason scientists publish detailed studies like the Lawrence Livermore analysis. It is the entire reason the USGS makes its hazard maps completely free and publicly accessible online. It is the reason Shake Alert exists, and the reason emergency managers across the state run drills and publish preparedness guides year after year, even when public attention moves on to other things. It all comes down to one simple, well-documented truth backed by decades of disaster research. Knowledge measurably reduces harm. Communities that prepare in advance for major earthquakes consistently see lower death tolls and faster recoveries than communities that don't, even when the actual physical shaking they experience is identical in magnitude. Japan has proven this again and again through decades of investment in preparedness culture. Earthquake readiness is not a matter of luck. It is a decision made in advance before the ground ever starts moving. So let's talk about what that decision actually looks like in practice, because you can absolutely do something with everything you just heard. Start by learning your own earthquake zone. California's Alquist-Priolo fault zone maps are free, they're public, and they show exactly which areas carry the highest hazard for fault rupture specifically, separate from general shaking risk. If you live, work, or send your kids to school anywhere near the Hayward Fault, the San Andreas, or any other mapped active fault, that is information genuinely worth having, and it takes about 10 minutes to look up. Build a go bag and actually keep it somewhere accessible, not buried in a closet you'll forget about. At minimum, aim for 3 days of water per household member, any medications you or your family need regularly, copies of important documents like identification and insurance papers, a battery-powered or hand-crank radio, a reliable flashlight, and cash and small bills, because ATMs and card readers may not function for days after a major event when power and communications networks are down. If you rent or own in an older building, find out whether it has actually been seismically retrofitted, not whether you assume it has. Soft story buildings, the ones with weak open ground floors like parking garages or storefronts, rank among the most dangerous structure types during a major quake. California runs retrofit incentive programs, and many cities have mandates written into law, but compliance is nowhere near universal across the state. And renters in particular often have no real visibility into the structural condition of the building they sleep in every single night. A simple call or email to your landlord or property manager asking about retrofit status is a reasonable, low-effort place to start. And then there's the insurance question, which deserves serious consideration given everything you just heard. Only about 13% of California homeowners currently carry earthquake insurance. The California Earthquake Authority offers policies specifically designed for this risk. They are genuinely not cheap, and that cost is a real barrier for a lot of families. But for the majority of homeowners, their house represents the single largest financial asset they will ever own in their lifetime. Without coverage, a major earthquake that damages or destroys that home can leave a family paying off a mortgage on nothing but rubble, with no financial safety net to rebuild. The map of California's faults has not physically changed. The faults sit exactly where they have always sat, buried under the same cities, running beneath the same neighborhoods they have run beneath for millions of years. What has changed is the science describing them. The Lawrence Livermore study, revising shaking estimates upward by 50%, is not a minor academic footnote buried in a journal nobody reads. It is a fundamental rewrite of what the actual hazard looks like for millions of people. This month's earthquake swarm on the Hayward Fault is not proof that the big one is arriving tomorrow, and nobody credible is claiming that it is. But it is a timely physical reminder, arriving in the same stretch of time that other seismically active regions around the world experience their own significant earthquakes, that the forces shifting beneath our feet are not some distant theoretical concern confined to textbooks and government reports. They are active. They are ongoing right now as you listen to this. And eventually, on a timeline nobody can predict with precision, they surface in ways that matter enormously to real people living real lives. California is not just earthquake country in some vague historical sense passed down from old stories about 1906 and 1989. It is, by nearly every measure scientists use, the most seismically exposed major urban economy anywhere on the planet, home to tens of millions of people, trillions of dollars in infrastructure, and some of the most consequential fault systems on Earth, all sitting directly beneath some of the most valuable and densely populated real estate in the country. And the real question was never really whether a major earthquake is coming, because on a long enough timeline, scientists will tell you plainly that it is essentially guaranteed. The real question, the one that actually matters for you personally, is whether you and the people you care about will be genuinely ready when it finally does. If this walked you through something you did not fully understand before, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one, because there is a lot more of this story still to tell. Send this to someone in California who needs to actually see these numbers laid out plainly instead of buried in a government PDF nobody opens. And then, seriously, go put together that go bag. Fill up a few extra water jugs. Check on the building you live in. Look up your earthquake zone. None of this is difficult, and none of it takes more than an afternoon. It is just the kind of thing that is endlessly easy to keep putting off, right up until the moment the ground stops giving you the choice.